technology in some form could come to the rescue? Because given the time horizon I hear you describing with respect to China in particular, I'm not hearing any real basis for a save. It's like I'm picturing like that game of chicken that I don't know if it ever existed, but it exists in the James Dean film Rebel Without a Cause, where you have two cars racing toward the brink, daring each other to stop at the last possible minute. And Ian has just described how impressively beautiful the interior of China's car is and how well upholstered it is. But on your account, given the demography, there's simply no brake on the car, and it's going to go hurtling into the abyss, whatever they're up to with respect to building out cutting-edge technology in the next decade.
Well, let's deal with big data first, and then let's go to the sex imbalance. So I agree that when it comes to manipulating and utilizing big data, the Chinese are without peer. U.S. marketing's pretty good at it, but that's not the same as just having a whole state that's built around it. I have a concern that is translatable into other things. It's not that it's an economic nothing burger by any stretch of the imagination, not what I'm saying. However, when it comes to transposing that and turning it into any other useful product in any other sector, I am very dubious. China has some incredibly brilliant people working there, and they are doing some incredibly sophisticated work, but it is a very small cadre of a very small cadre. If it was otherwise, the Chinese would have no problem building the fab facilities they need to make their semiconductors themselves, and they are making the low-end semiconductors. There are a number of issues of national security with economic matters that the Chinese would love to be world leaders in, and they're just not. So you can have a handful of Galileos in China, but they can't translate that down to the rank and file of engineers, much less the regular workers, in a volume that's necessary to generate the lever that they need.
And you also can't eat big data, right? I mean,
there's that too, yes. Yeah. When it comes to raw commodities, it's really you have them or you don't. You can do things like the Japanese and figure out how to get by with less, and that's always useful, but you still need to have them. So you can have pockets of the Chinese economy that remain dynamic even as the rest of the system goes into breakdown.
To be clear, you can't eat big data, but you don't need to eat nearly as much when your population is shrinking this much. So part of this...
So the question is whether or not with a degraded demography they can maintain some sort of economic coherence. And like I said earlier, we're moving into completely unexplored territory.
And also the idea that big data, even if it doesn't allow you to create and productize, and I think the jury is out on that, it might also afford you a much greater level of political stability, given greater economic volatility. That means China doesn't implode, while in the United States, you can have a lot more growth, and yet you have a lot of these technologies that aren't leverageable by a government that doesn't regulate them, and civil society actually erodes. So it may well be that you end up being more right on the economic side, but that the politics undermines the model.
And I would argue the inverse is potentially true as well. We don't know how a state control system that the Chinese are developing is going to work with modern economic theory. It's never happened before. So January 2020, let me back up. All census data is based on a series of guesses. And even if the state is being as honest as they can, it's still just a guess until you actually go out there and count the snouts. Now, in January of 2020, the last, what I consider to be robust data release from the Chinese, that was when they came to the conclusion that by the year 2100, they were only going to have 700 million people. And at that point, the sex imbalance for people aged 40 and under was between 5 and 20% off based on which province that you were in. And these were their own internal estimates based on primary school enrollments going back for the previous decade. The newer data that has come out in just the last several weeks suggests that 2100 date is probably closer to 2050. And that the sex imbalance is probably at least twice as bad as they thought it was. Because local governments get their budget based on how many kids are in school. So the local administrators would simply inflate the data and then try to make the male and the female data more or less line up. Now, this is not official data. These are a series of leaks. These are people from the Shanghai Academy of Sciences getting a hold of pieces of the 10-year census, which was completed a couple of years ago but hasn't been released. And if this new information is correct, the sex imbalance is so far worse than anything we have ever seen in human history, including in the Sri Lankan civil wars of the 1970s and 1980s. It suggests that in some provinces, especially some of the urban ones, that the sex balance may be a factor of 3 to 2. I don't see a country surviving without women. Maybe there's something in economic theory I'm missing here, but I don't see how that works at all.
So what are you actually picturing? So when you say a country is not going to survive, you're talking about it fragmenting as a political entity and undergoing some kind of failed state condition, or you're talking about famine? What is
those are all possibilities that should be considered. Chinese history has a robust litany of examples of how once several central control breaks, that the rest of the system breaks apart very, very quickly. But none of those has happened in a period of demographic decay. So I see challenges to economic coherence. I see challenges to state power. I see challenges to central power. I see challenges to the food security system. And all of it is happening at the same time that we're looking at a population collapse that is literally unprecedented in human history.
Okay, well, on that cheerful note, let's talk about how bullish you are by comparison for America in particular, I guess North America in general. Why is our condition so much different in a deglobalizing world than the Chinese, or really more or less anywhere else on the map?
Well, let's start with the basis. We never globalized our economy to the degree of everyone else. It was a bribe. And if we had included our economy in the bribe, it wouldn't have been a bribe and we wouldn't have had as many takers. So to a degree, the degradation of American manufacturing is in part not a bug, but a feature. We specifically opened up our market and did not necessarily demand reciprocal attention. That's part of why the populists are doing so well now, because you carry that on for 50 years and it starts to change a few things. From a demographic point of view, because we had more time and because we had more space, we had a different structure. Now, I'm part of Gen X. I'm part of the smallest generation ever. My parents are of the silent generation. That's the generation that suffered during the Great Depression and the World Wars. So they suffered lacks of opportunities and a lot of deaths, and that makes my generation small. But the baby boomers are the children of the GIs who came home for the war. And at the same time that they came home, we also opened up the suburbs. And so we had those cheap costs of living that we were talking about earlier. And so you had a more robust generation in a more robust economic environment, and that generated the baby boomers. And today, the baby boomers' kids are an equally large generation. We know them as millennials. Whereas my generation's kids are another small generation. We know them as Zoomers. The millennials of the United States, despite all the negative stereotypes, have one huge thing going for them. They exist. That has not happened in most of the rest of the advanced world. Everyone else, when the war ended and you had the baby boomers being born, they were a heavily urbanized environment, very few suburbs, and so their birth rates were lower than the generation.